You're listening to the Assembly Call IU podcast and postgame show, the place where Indiana fans across the globe hang out online after every IU basketball game. If you want to get more out of being an IU basketball fan, then make sure you're subscribed to our email newsletter. Go to assemblycall.com/join today and sign up for free. That's assemblycall.com/join. This episode of the Assembly Call is brought to you by Crane Credit Union. Get a $150 deposit into your new Crane Credit Union checking account when you get e-statements, have direct deposit, and use your debit card. Plus, there's no monthly service charges and no minimum balance to open your account. Stop into any of Crane Credit Union's 14 locations or visit their website at cranecu.org for more information. That's cranecu.org. Crane Credit Union is federally insured by NCUA. And now, get ready for another brand new edition of the Assembly Call. And welcome, Hoosier fans, to another off-season episode of the Assembly Call. I am your host, Jared Morris, and this is a very special edition of the Assembly Call as we are publishing this episode on April 4th, 2017. The significance of that date is that it is the birthday of one of the most important, influential, and exceptional characters in the long and proud history of Indiana basketball, and that is Bill Garrett. It would be Bill Garrett's birthday today. He is no longer with us in person, but his spirit, his legacy, his impact, just what he represented, what he did, all of that certainly is. And this weekend, Bill Garrett will be commemorated with an Indiana State historical marker on the Indiana University campus, an honor that has been a long time coming. And on this episode of the Assembly Call, I am joined by Tom Graham, who wrote the book Getting Open, the unknown story of Bill Garrett and the integration of college basketball. For those of you who have been subscribed to the Assembly Call for a while and who get our Six Banner Saturday news roundups, back on December 31st of 2016, I dedicated one of our weekly news roundups to Bill Garrett. It was right after I had finished reading the book Getting Open, and it's just, my immediate reaction upon finishing the book was that every IU fan needs to read this book, and I continue to believe that. I think it is essential reading, not just for IU basketball fans, but anybody associated with Indiana University. Really, I think any college basketball fan should read this and learn the story of Bill Garrett and learn the role that he played, and that people from the great history of Indiana University like Branch McCracken and Herman B. Wells, the roles that they played in breaking what at the time was a gentleman's agreement among Big Ten universities to not play black basketball players. As crazy as that sounds, it wasn't that long ago. And reading this book was a reminder of obviously where we were, how far we've come, and of course, in many ways, how far we still have to go. But it's also, in addition to that and what it represents in terms of race relations and Indiana University's role in integration, especially in the integration of college basketball, it's also the story of a great basketball player. Bill Garrett was a phenomenal basketball player, both at Shelbyville and at Indiana, and he was a great man, and his legacy lives on today in his sons and grandsons and what they're doing in basketball. And this book, I cannot recommend highly enough. Again, it's Getting Open, the unknown story of Bill Garrett and the integration of college basketball. And Tom Graham, one of the co-authors, along with his daughter Rachel, was one of the key drivers in getting this historical marker placed for Bill Garrett, along with Bob Hamill. And so Tom joins me on this episode of the Assembly Call to talk about that, to talk about the journey to getting this marker placed, to talk about why Tom was the one to write this story about Bill Garrett and why this is such a passion project for him, a lifelong passion, really. And we also talk about Bill Garrett, the player, the man, the legacy. What else can be done to honor his legacy? It's a wide-ranging conversation. Tom has enormous amounts of insight. I'm so appreciative of him for the time that he gave me in this conversation. And I really hope that if you do already know the story of Bill Garrett, that it reminds you of just how great of a player he was, everything that he meant, and that hearing this podcast will spur you to share it with someone else who may not know the story, especially a younger Indiana basketball fan. And if you don't know the story of Bill Garrett, I hope this opens your eyes to one of the greatest players to ever play at Indiana University, but also unquestionably one of the greatest and most important men to ever play at Indiana University. It's a remarkable story. I'm excited to share now my conversation with Tom Graham, talking about Bill Garrett with you on this episode of the Assembly Call. Tom Graham is an IU graduate, a member and former chairman of the World Trade Organization's appellate body in Geneva, Switzerland, and the co-author, along with his daughter Rachel, of one of the essential IU basketball books, Getting Open, The Unknown Story of Bill Garrett and the Integration of College Basketball. He is also our guest on this episode of the Assembly Call. Tom, welcome. It is truly an honor to be able to speak to you today. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you, Jared. I'm glad to be here.
Absolutely. So we're going to spend some time today talking about Bill Garrett, who, if you don't know, was Indiana's first black basketball player and the man who is credited with breaking the gentleman's agreement among Big Ten schools to not play black players, which was in place for a long time. Garrett is unquestionably one of the most important figures in IU basketball history, really in the university's history as a whole. And the timing of this conversation is not a coincidence, because coming up in Bloomington this weekend, and we're recording this on April 4th, so the weekend of April 7th and 8th, in Bloomington, a state historical marker for Bill Garrett will be unveiled in front of the Ora L. Wildermuth Intramural Center. This honor is a long time coming, and Tom, you were one of the driving forces behind making it happen. And so before we kind of begin discussing your book and learning more about Bill Garrett, the man and the player, I'd love for you to just expound a little bit on what is happening this weekend, how anyone listening can get involved, and why this is such a significant event.
Thanks, Jared. Glad to. What is happening this weekend is the placement, as you said, of a historical marker honoring Bill Garrett in front of the field house where he played, which is the Ora Wildermuth Intramural Center on the Bloomington campus. This is the result of an application made by Bob Hamill, the well-known sports writer and former sports editor of the Bloomington newspaper, and I, starting about a year ago, and then working closely with the Indiana Historical Bureau on original sources to confirm the events, and also on the wording of the marker, which was negotiated with IU. The wording of the marker, I will have to paraphrase. I'm afraid I don't have it in front of me, but it encapsulates the essence of the, at least basketball part of the Garrett story, and that is that he was Mr. Basketball in Indiana in 1947, led Shelbyville to the state championship, set scoring and rebounding records, and no one recruited him. No white school, majority white university, even contacted him about a scholarship, because in the Big Ten there was an explicit understanding, unwritten but clear, documented in the IU archives, which my daughter and co-author found and is cited in our book, saying, nothing written, but the unwritten rule observed by all is no Negroes, as they said then, in basketball, swimming, or wrestling. And as we say, basketball, swimming, and wrestling, all that skin, sweat, and contact so close to the fans. The Big Ten Gentlemen's Agreement was one of the centerpiece ones, but most conferences had those agreements, and very, very few blacks had ever played major college basketball at that time. IU did not recruit Bill Garrett. What happened was a very strong black leader, Fabrin de France, head of the Senate Avenue Y, the segregated black Y in Indianapolis, led a delegation down to talk to Herman Wells, President Herman Wells of IU, put pressure on Wells, who was trying to integrate the campus over opposition, and to talked to Branch McCracken, who agreed, the coach, basketball coach, who agreed to give Garrett a chance to play if he was on the campus, making his grades, going to school, and went out for basketball and made the team. This is Mr. Basketball. Went out, had to go out for basketball and make the team. And then the great poetic justice is he became an All-American, set IU scoring and rebounding records, graduated in 4 years, and by his example on and off the court, he opened basketball to black players. The year after he graduated, there were 7 blacks on 5 Big Ten teams. And that encapsulates the story. It also goes broader, which we could talk about with regard to integration and with regard to basketball being an example, which helped with further integration. The IU campus was integrated at the dorms and dining halls during Garrett's period there. He was very popular on campus.
And I do want to get into all that. I would love for you to explain what is the significance of the marker being placed in front of a building named after Ora L. Wildermuth, because that's a pretty significant part of the story too.
Yes, yeah. We've been asked several times, and the question usually came up in what to us was a surprising form, and that is, are the Garretts willing to have the marker placed at that building bearing Wildermuth's name? And I should back up, actually, and say we document in the book quotations found in the archives by Ora Wildermuth, saying, in essence, it's a pity they have to be on the campus because they're not as competent as whites, and segregation is necessary because if a person has 1/16 colored blood, he is colored, and things like that. This was the chairman of the board of IU at the time, whose name is on the building. And the question often was, well, are the Garretts willing to have it placed there? And our answer has uniformly been, this was the place where Garrett played. This is the appropriate place to have the marker. It's the field house where Garrett played. And if there is a problem with the incongruity of Wildermuth's name being on the building, the problem is with the name, not with the placement of the marker. So I think the placement of the marker is absolutely appropriate because it is where he's played. If it raises the question of the fieldhouse name, so be it. That's the fact.
It's probably a question that should be raised and discussed. And there was a proposal at one time, right, to have Garrett's name and Wildermuth's name on the same sign outside of the fieldhouse, right?
Yes. The Daily Student, in fact, exactly 10 years ago this coming Sunday, coincidentally, the Daily Student ran a front page opinion editorial saying they usually don't do that, but they thought this was important enough, and they quoted the Wildermuth quotes that I paraphrased a minute ago, which they had retraced in the archives from the citation in our book, and then had with an editorial describing Wildermuth's quotations, describing Garrett's achievements, and saying that the name of the field house should be changed. And that started a movement which led finally to a resolution of the board to change the name of the field house, but to change it, they were concerned about taking Wildermuth's name off because they thought it might be a slippery slope. There might be others who had skeletons in their closet and that kind of thing. And so they proposed to name it Garrett-Wildermuth. And when that actually made national press stories at the time because at that time there hadn't been name changes of this kind since there have been many. But in any event, it was in the national press. The Garrett family, when they got wind of this, adamantly refused to have Bill Garrett's name joined with Ora Wildermuth's name. So the national press then ran another number of stories saying it's all off because the Garrett family won't allow this. And that was a bit of an embarrassment for IU, and it still remains kind of a sensitive point, I think.
What were your thoughts on that at the time when it was proposed?
I have to confess, two things. One is IU did contact me at the time because I knew better than anyone else the Garrett's contact information, and I gave them the Garrett's contact information, and it fell through the cracks whether they were thinking that I would clear it with them or I was thinking, as I was, that they would take it up and clear it with them from then on. So I feel a little bit of guilt or responsibility on that. On the thing itself, I think, to be honest, I thought at the time, until I heard from the Garretts about it, I thought that this maybe was the best that could be done, and that getting Garrett recognized that way probably would be okay. I don't think I would come out that way now, having had heard a lot more of people's views and thought more about it. But that, to be honest, is what I thought at the time.
So in terms of this weekend, the ceremony is going on for people who are in Bloomington, who are close and who want to, go attend, or, for people who want to share and spread the word. What's the best way for people to get involved and do so?
Well, I would like as many people as want to attend. It's open to the public. The IU did send out invitations to people who had a special connection to the story, but we all made sure that that doesn't imply any exclusivity. It's open to the public, and there will be about a 45-minute or so period of speakers, which will include videos by the Commissioner of the Big Ten, Jim Delaney, taking responsibility for the Big Ten, which was very important to us, that this was a Big Ten breakthrough, and acknowledging the gentleman's agreement, and by Quinn Buckner, who is now, of course, a member of the board, on behalf of the legatees of Bill Garrett's legacy at IU, as well as Billy Garrett, who's an assistant coach at DePaul, Bill's son, as the main speaker, and I, and then someone from the Indiana Historical Bureau, and one or two others. But anyway, about a 45-minute speaking thing. Then a short luncheon for everybody. We made sure that also is for anyone who attends. And then a lifting of the veil over the marker, unveiling the marker in front of the Fieldhouse. The ceremony itself, or the initial speaking, will be held in Alumni Hall in the Union Building, as out of concern for rain, and so that the videos can be shown. But as far as getting the word out and attending, I would urge anyone who is interested and wants to attend. We already expect maybe 150 people or so, and it could be a lot larger than that. But anyone who is interested in Bill Garrett's achievement, interested in showing support for that, and interested in hearing speakers like that talk about it, and it will be kind of a key moment in which Indiana University and the Big Ten acknowledge the gentleman's agreement in order to fully appreciate the breakthrough that Bill Garrett made. So I would say everyone attend who wants to. It'll be in the Union Building, Alumni Hall to begin with at 11 a.m., and the unveiling will be about an hour after that on the south side entrance of the old field house, now the Intramural Center.
So this gentleman's agreement, has that been formally acknowledged anywhere but in your book?
That's a good question. I have to think. It was an open secret at the time. I mean, nobody wrote about it, which is another whole factor. The white press at the time did not write about race relations much anywhere, and certainly not on the sports pages. So no one wrote about it then. It was uncovered and cited in our book. I guess maybe people who have written about the book have echoed it, saying it was there. Whether anyone has, as an original matter, said there was this agreement, we should recognize it, that kind of thing, I'm not aware of anything. I think when there were comments on our book and various times after the books, things about Bill Garrett would come up. It was mentioned, but it was mentioned as a repetition of something that had been put in the book.
Well, and speaking of your book, our mutual friend Bart Kaufman sent me your book, and I'm so grateful to him for doing so because I hadn't read it yet, and it is such an important read, and it's such an engaging read, really an essential story that is told very, very well. And when I got done reading it, I had many thoughts, but there were two that were prevailing. Number one, every IU basketball fan needs to read this book. It's truly essential reading if you're an IU basketball fan.
Thank you.
Yeah, well, really, if you're associated with Indiana, because it's such an important part of the Indiana story. And the second thing that crossed my mind is how in the world is Bill Garrett not in the Basketball Hall of Fame? And so before we address that question, for which I really don't think there's a good answer, and you'll probably agree with me, let's start from the beginning, because I'm curious. What drove you to be the one who finally told Bill Garrett's remarkable story?
Thank you. I thank you for everything you said. And let me just in one line say, I have never done this to sell books. We will never end up making back, what we put into the book and on research and that kind of thing. And it isn't that. It is a labor of love. It is a practically an obsession with me. I grew up in Shelbyville. I was 4 years old in 1947 when Bill Garrett led Shelbyville to the state championship, and we had just won World War II. And in my 4-year-old mind, those two things were equated: winning the state winning World War II, and winning the state championship.
Spoken like someone from Indiana.
Yeah. Well, my parents had season tickets. My father went to all the games. My mother described them and what was going on in town. And even as a 4-year-old, and then up through 8-year-old with Garrett's achievements in Indiana, I had I remember a strong feeling of pride. I couldn't have articulated it really well, but a feeling of pride in Bill Garrett, not only his basketball achievements, but his the poetic justice of it. I remember, actually, as a 4-year-old, I remember distinctly, my father coming home and saying, why, Bill's going to play at IU. He's going to be the first colored boy to play there. And saying proudly and happily. So I grew up with that. And all my life I had wanted to write a story about the story of the season, of the 1947 season of the state championship. And when Rachel got involved, she had just finished a master's degree at Harvard in African American Studies. And she developed the whole race relations, segregation, the whole putting it into the context of what was going on in terms of race relations at the time. So it became a much bigger story, and it was life-changing for me. I spent my whole career in international law, a very different, dry subject, and nothing has ever. I've never been as impassioned about anything as about this story.
How long ago did you write the book?
It was a 7-year effort. The two of us. We started in 2000. Started in 1999. The book came out in March of 2006 in hardback by Simon & Schuster's Atria Books, an imprint of Simon & Schuster, and then the Indiana University Press paperback in 2008. So it's been around 10 years.
So let's, obviously, one of the elements that makes the story so special is how great of a player Bill Garrett was. I mean, at the end of the day, it obviously is remarkable what he did, as a pioneer and what he meant and what he represented. But he was also just a really good player, and you mentioned he was Mr. Basketball in 1947, set all kinds of records at IU as an undersized center, by the way. Can you speak a little bit about, what Bill was like as a player at Shelbyville and what kind of player he was at Indiana?
Yeah, I have the vaguest memories of actually seeing him play in high school, but my father was a pretty good observer and also reinforced this, and then I've seen films since then of him at IU and also a film of the next to last game, the afternoon game of the state championship in 47. He played every position. He was almost 6'3", between 6'2.5" and 6'3", and his natural position was as a center, and he actually played center at IU at 6'3". But he also could bring the ball up the floor. He could play all 5 positions, and as we say in the book, and sometimes did on successive plays even. He had an instinct, and it's apparent watching him. He had an instinct for being in the right place at the right time, being the center of things. He had a turnaround jump shot, which was very rare then in 1947, a very effective turnaround jump shot. He had a very fast pivot move with his back to the basket, with the basket going around his defender. And what we say also in the book, it was a dilemma for people guarding him, because if they played him close, he was so quick that he would pivot around them for a layup or a reverse layup, and if they played laid off him, he had either a reverse jump shot or what was somewhere between a one-hander and a jump shot at that time that he was very accurate with from 15 feet or so. And he was also very, very fast. He came in somewhere very high in the Big Ten in the 440, and was very quick and fast, and he led a lot of fast breaks. He would rebound, kick the ball out to the side. They'd get it to the center, and by the time they got down the floor, Garrett was coming up the side, for a layup.
And, you mentioned earlier that, Herman Wells, kind of convinced Branch McCracken to give him a try, and Branch obviously said that he could try out, and if he earned a spot. What was Branch's reaction when he kind of got a hold of Bill Garrett and saw him play? Was it an immediate, oh my goodness, look at what I have here? Did Bill struggle with, once he became a member of the team, to be accepted by coaches and players? How did that process go for him?
At that time, freshmen weren't eligible for the varsity. So Garrett spent a whole year playing on the freshman team. And interestingly, the blacks attended the practices then of the freshman team until they closed the practices. And they also attended, IU students had not attended a lot of games before they started attending the freshman game. The freshmen played a curtain raiser for the varsity freshman game, and sometimes leaving for the varsity game. So McCracken had to be very well aware, but he pretty much ignored Garrett, as he did all freshmen in the first year. And I describe, actually throughout from freshman year, McCracken's view as giving Garrett a chance to prove himself, not giving him special treatment, being careful not to give him special treatment, but also being careful that he was treated sufficiently and had a chance, and embracing it. Garrett started his very first game, and he started every game in his college career, starting with his first game, except maybe like junior or senior year. He and some others were benched after a bad game, benched once or something. But McCracken and Garrett, the McCracken and Garrett families became very close afterwards. We quote in the book that after McCracken retired, he was asked to name his favorite player ever after his 23 seasons. And he hesitated a minute, and he said, now, what would Bill Garrett say if I'd leave any of them off, or 100 other boys, if I'd leave any of them off the list?
What were Indiana's teams like there? Because obviously the Hoosiers won a title in 1940 and 1953, and Garrett's tenure at Indiana fell within that. Were those good Indiana teams?
They were not very good until Garrett got there. They had a series of 500 seasons in the middle of the Big Ten in the years between about 1945 and 47. And Garrett's sophomore year, they were they were about 13-8, I think, and his junior year they were 18-5, and his senior year they were 21-3. The team that had their center was 6'3", and they were never ranked lower than 7th in the country his senior year, between 3rd and 7th in the country, and they swarmed all over the floor, being that small. They pressed all over the floor. They ran. They fast break, a lot of fast breaks, better condition than most other teams. Ran the opponents out of the gym and things like that.
And obviously it took a player of Bill's magnitude and someone with his just character and fortitude to be the guy to assume this role. But this is also, something that wouldn't have happened without someone like Herman Wells. And I think his impact here, not just obviously in helping to get Bill Garrett onto the Indiana team, but just on a whole, what he did to help integrate the Indiana campus. Can you speak a little bit to just the profound impact that Mr. Wells had on this occurring?
Yeah, Herman Wells was a giant of a figure. I always go and find the Wells statue on the old part of the campus and pat him on the shoulder when I'm there. But Wells had been for years quietly trying to integrate the IU campus, but Ora Wildermuth was the chairman of the board, and Wildermuth was an outspoken racist, demonstrated to be, and favored segregation on the campus. And the issue for a couple of years was whether they would either integrate the dorms for black women initially and then black men, but whether they would integrate the dorms or whether they would build a separate housing unit for the black students, because the black students could only live off campus. Every year, IU took no more than 81 black women, because that was the number of rooms for them or beds for them off campus. And so Wells and the dining halls were segregated, and so were a lot of the social events and things like that. And Wells had been quietly working for years. ROTC was segregated also. That a doctor had given a blanket opinion that all blacks had flat feet, which kept them out of ROTC, and student teachers couldn't student teach in Bloomington. So anyway, Wells had been working for years to try to one by one change this under the radar. He was quoted in his book, I think, as saying, "I wanted to win every battle and not lose one," but he had to be careful. There was not only Wildermuth, there was a lot of the upper level of the administration in the university. There was a state legislature that was cautious and things like that. So Wells was a giant at that. And the Garrett situation is one that demonstrates very well his working behind the scenes. There was one other one that's kind of funny, which is that the swimming pool was segregated, the swimming pool in the old field house. So Garrett asked Rooster Coffey, who was the most popular black football player, to go at the busiest time of the swim, just go and jump in. And he did, and nobody complained. And as Wells said, a policy was changed, and nobody even realized.
So if it hadn't been Bill Garrett, how long do you think it would have taken for Indiana to integrate its basketball team and for the Big Ten to eventually integrate and break the gentleman's agreement?
It would certainly have happened. It had to happen. There were too many good black players coming along, and the pressures, coaches wanted to win, of course, and the pressures would have been such. It's hard to say exactly when, but surely within a few years. As it happens, IU did not have a second black basketball player until 1952-53 season, Wally Choice. And Wally Choice was a very good player and an all Big Ten player, but he wasn't an All-American, but he was still very good. But I don't know. It would have happened in the coming years. What actually happened was, after Garrett, basketball integrated by ones and twos, a sort of dribble of black players that hadn't existed before, into the game until Wilt Chamberlain, first Bill Russell, and then Wilt Chamberlain and Oscar Robertson and Elgin Baylor in the late 50s broke it open. So there was a period of about 5 years after Garrett when there was a stream of blacks in. And one of them would surely have done it to one of the schools sooner or later. The year after he graduated, there were 7 black players on 5 Big Ten teams, which is a remarkable just statement of what he did, since there had been none before.
So given how great Bill was as a player, and certainly what he represented in a larger sense, how in the world is he not in the Basketball Hall of Fame?
That's also a good question. Bob Hamill and I tried. We applied 2 or 3 years ago, and even went to New York for the ceremony with hope that he would be named. There are 2 or 3 reasons. For one thing, to some extent, in my opinion, the Hall of Fame, the National Hall of Fame, Naismith Hall of Fame, is driven by statistics, player statistics. And Garrett, the time he played, his statistics are not spectacular by today's standards. They were record-setting for Indiana then, is one. For another, I don't know if Garrett would be in Basketball Hall of Fame for his play, his ability on the court alone. He was very, very good. But what really should put him there is the larger story. And in my observation, the Hall of Fame is not story-driven as much. It's headline-driven or attention-grabbing statistics-driven, things that can be listed in a press release like that. That's just my personal opinion. But I guess that sums it up. I think the story is not sufficiently well known.
That seems unbelievably short-sighted to me on behalf of the Hall of Fame. I mean, the Hall of Fame should be about stories, I would think. The story of basketball. And I don't know how you tell the story of basketball without Bill Garrett's part in it.
Yeah, well, I hope I'm not being too unfair to them in saying that. I mean, it's in a way, it unless they are persuaded otherwise or think about it otherwise, that what I described, being a little bit statistically driven, may be the natural kind of thing that happens. But yes, they have created a category for early African American pioneers, which I would think fitted Garrett to a T. Yeah. But even that category existed 2 years ago when we applied, and he wasn't chosen then. So possibly one thing that may come from something like this ceremony, if it is attended by a lot of people, and if publicity is attracted to it, and if the name of the field house also perhaps it adds to the attention, possibly there may be reconsideration, or the case may be stronger. It needs for the Big Ten, for IU and the Big Ten, to get behind it. The time before, it was only Bob Hamill and me. Mm.
Yeah, and I mean, I suppose if Jim Delaney is going to be there, and obviously Indiana is, honoring Bill in this way, maybe that. Do you have any sense of confidence or hope that this could be the next step, and maybe that's someday happening?
Yeah, well, certainly hope. And what I know about Jim Delaney comes from Bob Hamill, who has a very high opinion of him and a very good relationship with him. And I would think that this would certainly be a step toward Big Ten endorsement and support, and for IU as well. It's so far. Institutions have shied away from this, thinking it's better just not to talk about it, or better not to. It's bad publicity. We're better off to forget, which I don't think is the case at all. It's a win-win for everyone. Things were bad in the 1940s. Everybody knows that. That's a fact, and this is about how they changed. And the Big Ten and IU were. Implicated in a good way, were benefited from the change, facilitated the change, and can claim to some degree credit for it. And so, really, it's a positive story if seen that way for all.
Well, it is a positive story because obviously things did change, and I think it's. That's one of the things I got out of reading the book is just, the benefit of remembering how things were and how unfairly a class of people were treated. And, one of the passages from your book that has stayed with me, and I haven't been able to get it out of my head since I read it. And it's actually on pages 82 and 83 of the book. And, Emerson Johnson, one of the players who Bill Garrett played with at Shelbyville, he's, in the dedication at the front of the book, you say for Bill Garrett, Emerson Johnson, and Marshall Murray. And there's a story after they win the state championship game, and they have a dance at the National Guard Armory, and it's 2 a.m. and the dance is about over. And there's a girl, I don't know if you pronounce her name Roanne or Roan.
Roanne.
Roanne, and Emerson Johnson asks her to dance, and she kind of looks around and she's wondering to herself, well, I can't be seen dancing with Emerson Johnson, but it's late. There's not as many people there. The dance is winding down. He asks nicely, and so she accepts. And, you end it. Emmy Johnson slowly took a neatly pressed white linen handkerchief from his pocket, carefully unfolded it, and wrapped it around his brown left hand so it would not be in contact with Roanne's small, white right one. I mean, I read that, and it hit me like a ton of bricks reading that as just a reminder of this is less than 100 years ago, in the very state, where I grew up. And I agree. I can see why some people might not want to revisit that or remember that or acknowledge it, but how can we ever be sure that it won't happen again or that we won't make the same mistakes unless we acknowledge them and learn from them and remind ourselves of them? So,
well, yes, and what we're doing with this ceremony and everything else is celebrating the change in a way. But let me say also, first of all, thank you very much for the way you wrote, the blog you wrote about, and for your appreciation of the book. I really appreciate that. But on the story of the dance of Emerson Johnson and Roanne Weaver told that story. We report it exactly the way she told it to me, standing outside at about midnight after the 55th reunion of the 1947 class at Shelbyville. I went to the reunion of the class, and that would have been 2002, while we're still working on the book. And, the stories get told sort of at the end when people are about to leave. And standing in the parking lot, late at night, after the reunion had ended, she told that story.
Wow. Just Yeah, I've gone back and read it several times since then. It's an amazing passage, and I mean, there's so many passages like that in the book. And getting back to Bill, let's talk a little bit about what happened to Bill after he left Indiana, because he was drafted but didn't have a particularly notable professional career, although he did find success in basketball again as a coach in high school after that. Can you describe how Bill's basketball career went after Indiana?
Sure. He was drafted by the Boston Celtics. Incidentally, the Indiana Pacers, which were owned by the Kentucky players who had won the national championship for Kentucky in 1948, the Indiana Pacers bypassed him, and as did the Fort Wayne Pistons. And he was drafted by the Boston Celtics, but was also drafted by the Army. The Korean War was on, and at that time, at least, there was no way that he could get a deferment or anything. So he spent his Korean War years in Japan running a basketball league of some kind, came back, and it's hard to say exactly what happened. At that time, the Harlem Globetrotters were the most powerful and the biggest draw, the most popular basketball act, maybe most popular sports act in the world. They were really riding high. And the NBA was just getting started. And the Globetrotters would do favors for the NBA by letting an NBA team play the curtain raiser for the main event of a Globetrotter game, and they'd fill Madison Square Garden and things like that. So the Globetrotters had a lot of power over the NBA owners. And whether they pressured the Celtics or not is not clear. But the Celtics released Garrett, and the Globetrotters took him. He was, after all, a 6'2.5" or to 6'3" center in college. He couldn't have played center in the pros. And whether they saw him as not having a position or not is also a legitimate question. But in any event, he was with the Globetrotters. They called him part of the rhythm section, meaning he was not one of their show people, but one of the ones who set up plays and just played basketball. But he hated the life of the Globetrotters. No real competition. They played show games and things like that, and they played like 300 games a year and always on the road. And so he left after a couple of years, spent a year in Toledo, sort of where his wife, where Betty, was teaching, and then spent a year at Indianapolis as a freshman coach at Harry Wood High School in Indianapolis when the position came open at Crispus Attucks, which was dominating high school basketball in Indiana in the 1950s. Ray Crow had left to be athletic director, and Garrett was hired in that position. Everybody thought the poor guy is 28 years old. He can't possibly replace Ray Crow in the spotlight, the best team dominating the state. It was an all-black school, dominating the state, and so on. 2 years later, in 1959, he won the state championship with them as a coach, becoming what he still is, the only Mr. Basketball in Indiana ever to play on a state championship team and coach one for boys, the only in boys basketball. And then he was an Attucks basketball coach for several years, became the athletic director, ultimately became an assistant dean at Indiana Purdue, University of Indianapolis, IUPUI, and he died of a heart attack at age 45. Unfortunately, but he had a great and solid family, all of whom will be there. His son Billy is an assistant coach at DePaul now. His daughter Tina is a lawyer in Indianapolis. Another daughter is a pharmacist. Another daughter is a PhD in education. So and his grandson, William Leon Garrett II, named after Bill, was DePaul's star and Big East Freshman of the Year a few years ago, and is graduating from DePaul this year. Wow! So it's an outstanding family he raised. He was an outstanding man.
And he passed away so young. My goodness.
Yeah. He had a heart arrhythmia, and he probably wasn't as diligent as he should have been about taking his medicine for it, because after all, he was 45 and in very good shape and a former All-American and everything else. Yeah. And it was a heart arrhythmia attack.
For you, Tom, what's the quintessential story that sums up Bill Garrett, the man, not the player, but the man?
Maybe what we say in the book, toward the end of the book, by his his example on and off the court, he showed white Americans that they had been wrong in a way they could accept. I think that probably sums it up. And then also, toward the end of the book, Wally Choice, the second basketball player, I reached him on the phone while he was running his dry cleaning business. So in the middle of waiting on customers, he gave he said it about as well as it could be said for this. He said, and again, he's waiting on customers and everything, African Americans made me aware that I was following an icon, not just in basketball, but in personality too. I became aware that I couldn't mess up at IU or I would mess up the legacy. I would be letting him down. And he said, Bill Garrett made it a pleasant situation for me.
Wow. Do you get the sense that Bill felt properly appreciated or respected for the road that he walked?
Not when he was at Indiana. He gave an interview to a black newspaper at Ohio State at a game when they were at Ohio State to play in his senior year, and one of the things he said was, asked about how he was treated. He said, they all treat me swell, the way they talk back then. They all treat me swell, but too many act like they're doing me a big favor. So there was a bit of that. He also said, though, he said later in life, looking back at his IU career and All-American status and all that, I thought then that I had it made. I know now that I don't, which I thought was quite insightful. But he received so much recognition around Indianapolis, and he was so appreciated in the black community and all that. He cannot have failed to realize a lot about what he meant, certainly to the black community. But he was a very humble person who never boasted or never talked about his achievements or anything, and so in a way he never showed it if he fully understood.
It's obviously pretty clear what his legacy is in Bloomington, or at least it certainly should be. And hopefully, podcasts like these and your book and the event this weekend will help educate people who maybe don't know about that. But, back in Shelbyville, where the Bill Garrett story began, what is his legacy there? What is the memory of Bill Garrett in his hometown?
Well, since the book came out and the full story has reminded people and everything, there is enormous pride. I'd say tremendous pride. At the time, there was virtually, as far as I was aware then or knew in the years after, there was great pride in the state championship. There was great pride in Bill Garrett, too, then. When he came back with his Crispus Attucks team, I was playing for Shelbyville in the late 1950s and beginning of the 1960s. And Bill Garrett and his Crispus Attucks team played a game in Shelbyville. And when they introduced Garrett, there was a long standing ovation by the Shelbyville crowd. So he was very, very appreciated then in Shelbyville. I know what else I wanted to say, which is that one of the things that was very satisfying about the aftermath of the book was the number of whites in Shelbyville who would shake their head, who lived through the period, who would shake their head and say, I can't believe I was so oblivious. And the number of blacks who thanked us for giving voice to their story. Wow. And I thought we must have got the balance right. Yeah.
Well, no, you did. And if I recall correctly, Bill received a standing ovation at his last IU game as well, right?
Yeah, that was really something. I remember I would have been 8 at the time. My parents went to it. Again, as an example of how Shelbyville looked upon Bill Garrett. That my parents went there to be there for his last game. And I remember the next morning my mother saying, why, you never heard anything like it. Just with a sort of awe in her voice. And a lot of people who were there talk about it that way. When Garrett, Branch McCracken, I saw him do it in later games. The last home game of the season, if the game wasn't close, he would take his seniors out one by one for a sort of curtain call. And when that came for Bill Garrett in his last game, the entire 10,000 in the old field house stood for, their estimates vary from 1 minute to 3 minutes or so, standing ovation that sort of froze the players on the floor until the referees actually sort of stepped in and resumed the play on it.
Wow. And I assume that was a recognition both of just what a remarkable career he had as a player and an acknowledgement of what he represented, even though, obviously people were still in the time, like it was still kind of, history was unfolding at that moment.
Yeah, I think it was an implicit recognition. I thought for a long time about what adjectives to use in the book describing it. I called it impulsive and cathartic, kind of catharsis of. I don't think most of them, if you had asked most of those fans at the time, I don't think they could have described very well or very, very thoroughly or anything what had occurred and what Garrett had done, but they felt it implicitly and instinctively, and I think that's what it was.
Well, Tom, this conversation has been phenomenal. I really appreciate you lending so much insight. My last question for you: what else would you like to see done to properly honor the legacy of Bill Garrett? Either at IU, within the basketball program, at the Basketball Hall of Fame, on a state level. Like, what else would you love to see done to honor him?
Well, most of all, I'd like to see him in the National Basketball Hall of Fame. But besides that, it has been suggested by some, Bob Hamill and some others, such things as IU playing a game every year on December 3rd, which is the date at which he broke the gentleman's agreement. Let me come back to that in a minute. The date at which he played his first game for the IU varsity at home, December 3rd, 1948. Playing a game then and calling it Bill Garrett Night or something like that, or the Big Ten having a Bill Garrett Night, such things as that. Let me just return for a second to a point that's important. Garrett did not break the gentleman's agreement by playing one game on December 3rd, 1948. He broke the gentleman's agreement by conducting himself, playing so well on the court and conducting himself off the court for 4 whole years while he was playing alone. And it's that example that did it. But those are the kinds of things I'd like to see done. One last thing, or if you want it to be the last, that I would say, Jared, is today is Bill Garrett's birthday.
Today is April 4th.
Yep, today is Bill Garrett's birthday.
Wow, what perfect timing to have this interview.
Yes. Yeah, it's a nice coincidence.
Yeah, it is. Well, Tom, thank you again so much. Again, I highly recommend your book, Getting Open, The Unknown Story of Bill Garrett and the Integration of College Basketball. We will link to that in the show notes. If you are an Indiana basketball fan associated at all with Indiana University or just a fan of basketball in general, I think it's an essential story to know and to understand. And Tom, you did a great job telling it, and we appreciate you being here and giving us even more insight. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Jared.
Yeah, and also just thank you, to you and to Bob Hamill as well for all the work that you've put in to make what's happening this weekend and the historical marker happen as well, because that is it's an essential commemoration of what Bill Garrett represented and what he meant.
Well, thank you for really getting the story, getting what it is we were trying to say.
Absolutely. All righty. Thank you very much, Tom. Thank you for listening to this episode of The Assembly Call. If you want to support the show, please share The Assembly Call with a friend or family member who loves IU basketball like you do. You can also visit assemblycall.com/support to learn a few ways you can help, from donating to grabbing official Assembly Call gear to buying IU merchandise that you'd buy anyway, but using our special affiliate links, which get us a commission. We rely on the support of audience members like you to keep the Assembly Call alive and growing. Once again, the URL is assemblycall.com/support. Thank you, and as always, go Hoosiers.